This is the Limb Lengthening and Reconstruction Society podcast, Distractions, exploring the science, innovation, and people transforming limb deformity and reconstruction. LLRS is thankful for its podcast industry partners, Diamond Level Orthopediatrics, Sapphire Level Orthofix, and Garnet Level Smith & Nephew. On this edition of Distractions, Drs. Mitchell Bernstein and Reid Nichols welcome LLRS Hall of Fame inductee, Dr. Dror Paley.
Welcome to Distraction, the Limb Lengthening Reconstruction Society, also known as the LLRS podcast. We're here with Dr. Dror Paley, a world-renowned orthopedic surgeon and limb lengthening specialist. This is a true honor and unique opportunity to be with him, and we thank him for his time. He's known globally for pioneering limb reconstruction, limb deformity surgery. We also congratulate him on being inducted to the Hall of Fame at the LLRS annual meeting, the first class, alongside his colleagues John Herzenberg and Stuart Green. It's also a pleasure to be here with Dr. Reid Nichols.
Thanks, Mitch. So, Dr. Paley, I'm particularly excited to talk with you because I will tell you that you have completely revolutionized my life. You gave me a career that I would not have even thought about until I jumped on the website and looked for a place to go in Baltimore, and then I decided I was not doing trauma, that this was the coolest thing ever. So you are my start. So where is your start? How did you get into limb reconstruction and all of the things that you've done so far? It started someplace.
So I trained in Toronto, did my med school, my residency, and during that residency in my third year, Renato Bombelli, famous Italian hip surgeon, came to town and at Grand Rounds was shown a case of a tibial bone defect that we were going to amputate later that week, and asked how they would treat this in Italy. And he described what I now know as bone transport, but at the time had no understanding of what he described in his very animated Italian fashion with his hands going up and down and so on. And there wasn't a single question from the audience, which made me feel that I was the only dummy in the audience who had no idea what he was talking about. It must be something standard, and I better read about it. So I cornered him during the coffee break and asked him, "Can you explain that to me again? Sorry, I've never heard of this." And by the time he drew it out on a napkin for me, I realized that nobody in the audience had any idea, and they were just being polite and not asking because they all felt ignorant. And that was my start. First time I ever heard about distraction osteogenesis and Ilizarov and all this stuff. And then I met him. That was November of '83. And I met him at the American Academy meeting at the Hip Society, where he promised to bring me some literature. And, there's no email in those days. And so he bought me, and he didn't forget, he brought me a package of literature on this stuff from the Italian group, and that was my start. And my curiosity from that led me to doing my own literature search, going to Canadian Canadian version of the Library of Congress, and pulling out articles and reading the English abstract because they didn't read Russian back then, and then researching this. And of course, I had to finish my indentured servitude. That's called the residency. And when I finished that in in '85, I wrote my written Canadian exams in September, like 6th or something, and hopped on a plane the same night I finished the exam and flew to Lecco, Italy to check this out. And what I saw changed my life. Kind of like when you open the website, this was not a website. This is fantasy land. And, I spent a week with Maurizio Catani and Angelo Villa, and I said right there on the spot, I'm going to come back. Well, they were used to people coming back for a week or two. I said, I'm going to come back for 6 months. And he says, 6 months? Who comes for 6 months? I said, we call that a fellowship. And I said, I'm going to come and do a fellowship here. Fellowship. Anyway, all our communications were in French, and they didn't speak any English. And so I came back the following year, and with my wife, my pregnant wife, and my youngest son, who was 2.5, and we spent 6 months in Europe, which included 5 weeks in Soviet Union, and the rest is history.
how did you not start smoking? Because you were with all of those people smoking in the OR, Ilizarov. But how did you go from Italy to going to Russia? And then how did you handle all the personalities that you're with? How did you take from Ilizarov and not at all get compromised by his teaching style?
So I started doing basic science, biomechanical research at the University of Vermont in Burlington. I saw they had this model and testing all these external fixators. So I said, you know what, I'll get an Ilizarov fixator and I'll construct it, and we're going to compare it to all the other fixators. And I went there, and that became my first Ilizarov study with this, Richard's medical money.
Wait,
and
that's after,
85.
That's before you went to...
Yep. But I decided I'm going off. So now I also, and there were a bunch of conferences that were going to take place in Europe during the 6 months I was going to be away. So I also planned to go to the Orthofix Riva conference, present this paper, go to the Hoffman External Fixation Conference, present this paper, and go to this conference in Riga, Latvia during this time. I planned it all out and ahead of time. I planned my whole itinerary. The guys in Italy helped me get my visa. Get my invitation letter from Kurgan, and they just serendipitously were doing their second international conference in 1986. So it was like the stars aligned. Everything was in place, and I got at that time in the Soviet Union, you have to have every city listed on your visa, or you couldn't go there. And in fact, I wanted to take a different flight, which stopped in a city called Brezhnev, and it wouldn't let me go because it wasn't on my visa thing. I had to find a direct flight to Moscow, and then instead of taking the, a shorter route. So anyway, I got it all organized, and we left on this trip. We arrived in Europe the beginning of July 1986. Pregnant wife, 2.5-year-old, and great aspirations, and very excited about this whole thing. And it was a self-constructed traveling fellowship, self-funded. I got some support from Richard's Medical. Jack Blair, the CEO, was a visionary and could see this was really important. And off we went. And I spent time with Spinelli in Rome, and then Monticelli and Spinelli, and I spent time with the Verona group, De Bastiani, Aldegheri, Renzi Brivio, these guys in Verona, and then I landed in Lecco, where we set up shop for the rest of the 6 months, and including going with them to Kurgan. And, in the process, I came prepared. I decided I'm going to learn Italian and I'm going to learn Russian. And I brought all the books, none of this online Duolingo stuff, but, I brought all these books. I'd walk down the street with a little gem dictionary, pocket dictionary, and every time I'd think of a word, I'd look it up in Italian, and then I'd do the same thing in Russian. And in the process, everyone thinks the most incredible thing of that 6 months was learning the Ilizarov method. Absolutely not. It was learning 2 new languages that I still use to this day and remain fluent in. And so I learned Italian. I had a young brain then, not like now. But, I learned Italian and I learned Russian. And when I started in Lecco, so I was communicating only in French with everyone until then, because the Italians spoke French. They didn't speak English. Now they speak English. Nobody learns French in school there. And so it was very handy being Canadian, having grown up and learned French. I was pretty fluent in it. And then somewhere around 6 weeks into it, 6 weeks since I started in Rome, then Verona, and then Lecco, I switched. I started speaking Italian. And they never talked to me in French again. And it was the weirdest thing. I just one day responded to them in Italian, and they didn't respond in French. They responded in Italian, and we never used French between us ever again. And that forced me to, continually improve my Italian. And it was I don't know, it's the weirdest transfer. I still remember it, and it just changed. And I used this paper that I had brought with me. I even presented it in Kurgan. So I had it registered at 4 different conferences. It became like my traveling paper. It was great. And it made me look like I had some experience with the Ilizarov, because it was an Ilizarov biomechanics paper. So I couldn't have planned this thing better. And, so I spent time in Kurgan, in Lecco. And then I did a few other stops. I went to Davos. I went to visit a few other people, Oxford, to see Ken Wright and a few other people. But when it came time to go to Kurgan, which I think was in September of '86, I went off there, and I had also been working on my Russian. And my wife and I traveled around for 3 weeks, and touring and visiting sites. We were also secretly visiting refuseniks. We smuggled a lot of stuff for these Soviet Jews who were refused exit visas to Israel. So we were very involved in that, but secretly. And so that was our night job, and the day job, we were the perfect tourists, beyond suspect, obviously pregnant wife and little child, not spies or anything. So we got really involved in this underground movement to support these refuseniks, did that for 3 weeks, and then went to Kurgan. And, spent 2 weeks in Kurgan. And by the time I got to Kurgan, I was reasonably conversant in Russian. I know that sounds insane. I could also read and write, and I started using it. And my wife didn't come with me to that part. She went off actually with our son to Israel, and I did this on my own to Kurgan, and then I went to Riga, Latvia, and then left the Soviet Union. I presented a paper at Riga, Latvia, and I began having that Russian language was the biggest difference between me and the Italians. I didn't need a translator. Now, on that trip, I still did, but Ilizarov took an interest in me, the first North American to come there, Canadian, not really American, at the time. And he invited me back, and I came back. So this was like September, October of '86, and I came back in February of '87, the middle of winter. Nobody goes to Kurgan in the middle of winter. I brought my cross-country skis. I was Canadian. This was no big deal. And in fact, I had great experience cross-country skiing with the deputy director every single morning in Kurgan. That was really the trip I learned a lot, because I spent 5 weeks on my own. There were no other visitors at that time. A few Russians, so I trained with the Russians, but they had my own program. First day I got there, assigned me an interpreter, and the interpreter, interprets my question that I'd ask in English, and then the guy would answer, and then I'd ask another question. He says, "Don't you want to hear the answer?" No, I understood that. The next day he didn't show up. So, soon I was a free agent, and I could read the program for the OR schedule every day. And, the problem then was everything, the word for secret in Russian is sekret, and everything was secret, everything I'd ask. If you want to learn basic tibial lengthening, yeah, I could learn that. And so they'd assign me to the OR. There were 18 operating rooms. And they were running, a lot of them, all at the same time. And the operations I wanted to see, they weren't allowing me to go see. So I just worked out a system that I would read the OR, and I said, can I go see that tibial lengthening in room A? And room B was the widening of the leg that I really wanted to learn, or the foot correction and this. And so I'd wander into room B with a mask on. Nobody knows who you are. And then they'd catch on to this an hour later, and then they try to respectfully pull me out of the room. Dr. Such and Such wants to teach you this. Why don't you go down there? And I said, sure, I'll be there in just a minute. And having the language was like a passport. I could go anywhere I wanted. And they had a saying there so the institute at that time was called the Kniakot. which was Kurgan Institute of Scientific Orthopedics and Traumatology. And the saying was that if there was a crack in the wall of the Kniakot, Paley found it. And he cracked it.
So I would be curious to know how your experience seeing that as a kind of a new institute, how did it parallel with the Paley Institute? Because I do see a few similarities from what I know of you.
I would add, or ask you also on that note, it seems as though, like, if someone in our society speaks to you now, I mean, your accolades are too numerous to discuss, but as you talk about those years, like, did those years shape you? Like, those first 85, 86 seem to give you the tools to do what you've done till today. Would you say that is accurate? You know,
it's kind of like you asked, did your residency shape you, your medical school? I had a really strong foundation, and this was my foundation in Ilizarov. And interestingly, when you compare what I learned in 86 and 7 with what the Italians had learned from 81 to 87, I learned so much more. First of all, I got the input from Italy, which started me on a much higher level. And I got the direct input, unfiltered, uncensored, from talking to people. I used to take people out. Gorbachev had limited access to alcohol, so I used to take them to my hotel where I had complete access to alcohol, and you guys know I don't drink. Mm-hmm. And I'd buy them all the vodka they'd want, and their tongues would explain everything that I wanted to know about Ilizarov. So I learned things that nobody else knew. I learned that they actually open every congenital pseudarthrosis and bone graft it. Okay, nobody said that. They didn't show that on their slides.
So I have a follow-up to that also.
Yes, so do I. Okay, go ahead.
Well,
you win.
Confidence, conviction, ethics, like, you know, and you do things like the first of, you know, pioneering work. As a surgeon, it's like, you know, take some confidence to do that. And I know you're a very ethical surgeon. So is that, again, back to those years, did that, like, is that knowledge and experience allow you to constantly just be the first to? Because a lot of us, myself included, be very anxious to do so.
Or do you think that that a lot of these techniques are just blending things together and putting the right order?
So I think there's no question those years influence, but I think I think what you're observing is more obviously my personality. And, you know, your next interview is John Herzenberg was my partner for 19 years. And John was once asked, and it wasn't actually being asked nicely. It was a snide question he was asked. Your partner, Dror Paley, he paints outside the lines. And John thought about it and then responded, no, he just doesn't see the lines. And I think that was it. Lines are limits. And what Ilizarov gave me is the ability to see that there are that the limits that we think are artificial. The limits I'd grown up with in residency were artificial. You can't correct more than this many degrees of this, and you can't do more than this. And I suddenly realized there's no scientific basis for any of those comments. There were safe guidelines, which we still give our residents, but I learned to think outside the limits and stop seeing them as really hard limits, not like the speed of light is a limit, you know. So I learned to think outside of that. And, you know, you're right, it's always a balance still to this day between what's investigational, what's experimental, what's ethical, and so on. And you know, it's not that I assign myself that power to decide, but innovation, which I'm known for, is based on experience, failures, challenges, and problem solving. And the Ilizarov gave me an opportunity to problem solve in a barren field. And there were no answers. Amputation was the only answer I kept hearing over and over. And so looking for a better way to reconstruct the hip, the knee, the ankle, all of these things, and even lengthening over nail in the beginning, and these were these were pushing the limits. What you don't know is how much I suffered because of this. In 1991 or 2, one of the famous shock trauma surgeons, okay, next door, I won't mention names, wrote a letter to the Dean of Medicine at University of Maryland, basically saying that I was a loose cannon because I was lengthening over a nail. I was combining what was clearly known as negligence by combining internal with external fixation, something everybody does now. But when 1992, nobody did. Not only that, if you were sued from that, I'm sure you'd lose your lawsuit.
I think though, like, I see that now, like, getting a little bit more experience in trauma, but I see that you responded appropriately with our currency, which is publication. So I'm sure you were ridiculed and disrespected at meetings like this because you were, not to overuse the word, ahead of the time, but you responded, and your literature supports that. You responded accordingly.
Well, and I think the difference between you and Ilizarov is you don't need a secret room in your operating rooms. I mean, if you are an invited guest to the Paley Institute, the doors are open. I think you're very different than that. I think you give back to all of us. And because we need to continue innovation. We need to, you're not the only one that should be thinking outside of the lines. We should all be taking all these principles, putting them together. But how did you make that decision to be a teacher? I mean, my goodness, you could be highly productive without continuing to mentor, continuing to teach, because it takes time and energy and effort to...
We can turn this into a psychology session.
Exactly.
I go back to your first years and your career.
What keeps you going?
He's the ultimate influencer.
Yeah.
He's influenced as a surgeon, which is responsibly with your textbooks and publications, and like you said, the diagrams and very practical advice to his mentors, right? Like he's not...
Can I tell that to my 19-year-old son that I'm an influencer? Someone called me the godfather of orthopedics, and he goes around now telling everyone, my dad is the godfather.
But I actually want to ask that question. What keeps you being that mentor, being the person who's trying to teach? Like, you definitely, there's a balance that you have to reach between your own clinical experience, your own research, and then teaching courses, writing books. I mean, you could stop all this.
We all have our passions and our superpowers, okay? And I have mine, you have different ones, and that's what makes life interesting. Look, I think two of my superpowers, one is innovation, and the other is teaching. I think I'm a good teacher, and at least people have told me that, and I enjoy it. Okay, so I really enjoy seeing how I stimulate minds. You look in people's eyes, and you hear their questions, and you got to them, right? That's cool. And the other is innovation, and if you would allow me to read a quote of Steve Jobs, I read this quote, and I suddenly said, oh my God, that's me. He's talking about me. So I really saw me. This hangs outside my office door, and it says, here's to the crazy ones, the misfits, the rebels, the troublemakers, the round pegs in the square holes, the ones who see things differently. They're not fond of rules, and they have no respect for the status quo. You can quote them, disagree with them, glorify or vilify them. About the only thing you can't do is ignore them, because they change things. They push the human race forward. And while some may see them as the crazy ones, we see genius, because the ones who are crazy enough to think they can change the world are the ones who do. And, I read this. Yeah, I'm not a good rule follower. So I read this, and I said, damn, I think I, for the first time, understand myself, both my trials and my tribulations and my successes, and all of that were summarized in this incredible quote. And it takes someone who has suffered through this process of changing the world to recognize and appreciate that. And it's very humbling. it has humbled me, and it's made me appreciate, my own superpowers, whatever they are.
When you and Dr. Herzenberg went your separate ways, what is the thing that you would say that you missed most about working with him? Because you were partners for, wasn't it 18 years?
19, I think.
19.
Yeah. John was my best friend, closest colleague, all of the above. I mean, our families were close, and I figured we'd retire together, and never saw us going our separate ways. We were really good together because we complemented each other. And like any good married couple, we complemented each other. I was the innovator. I was the guy who would do things first, and was not afraid to, like you said, to spearhead, to be the vanguard, and so on. John was more cautious, he did not like to spearhead things. But John is an amazing developer. Best example is Ponseti. John didn't invent the Ponseti technique, but he was one of the first to read that little green book and see its potential and then help develop that to what it is today. It's the same thing with Taylor Spatial Frame. I did TSF before John. I, did all kinds of things with it. I spearheaded so many things. But John was the guy who would meticulously help develop that and grow it and teach it and so on, stuff that I get bored and move on to the next thing. And, John would come into my OR from finishing his case, and he says, "What are you doing?" I said, this, and this. "I thought we did it this way." I said, "Oh, God, I changed that last week. Where you been?" Try and keep up.
That is the quote to end on.
That's the quote to
that
end.
was so last week.
We do have to end.
Yes.
We thank you very, very much for
My
your time,
pleasure.
Dr. Paley. Congratulations again on being inducted to our first class Hall of Fame at the LLRS.
My pleasure.
And
Thank
it's
you.
pretty neat to know that you were the first president and that I actually got to come 32 years later. But thank you for all of your influence on us. Now
Thanks,
that we
guys.
call you the influencer.
The OG.
I am going to tell my son that. That is like,
don't need to be the
that's
Godfather.
even better than the Godfather.
Thank you for listening to Distractions, the official podcast of the Limb Lengthening and Reconstruction Society. Visit llrs.org to learn more about the Society and limb deformity and reconstruction.